The body is gone. The linen wrappings are still there, resting undisturbed in roughly the shape of a man. And a few inches away, separated from everything else in the tomb, is one small cloth, folded and set carefully apart. For centuries, Christians have been told exactly what that folded cloth means. There's just one problem. The explanation most of us grew up hearing may never have actually happened. To find out what that detail is really telling us, we have to go back to the moment someone first noticed it. The stone has already been rolled away by the time John reaches the entrance. It's still early. Early enough that the light spilling across the garden is thin and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look unfinished. He stops a few feet short of the opening, hands braced on his knees, chest heaving from the run, and for a moment he doesn't move any closer. Word had come from Mary Magdalene less than an hour earlier. She had gone to the tomb alone before sunrise, expecting to find exactly what she'd watched happen 2 days before: a sealed grave, a heavy stone in place, a body wrapped and laid carefully to rest. Instead, she found the stone already moved aside, the entrance standing open, and she ran. Not toward the tomb, but away from it, straight to Peter and to John, with words that assumed the worst. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb," she told them, "and we don't know where they've laid him." So the 2 men run. Neither has slept much, if at all. 2 nights earlier, they'd watched their teacher arrested. The next day, they'd watched him die in public, in the most humiliating way the Roman world knew how to kill a person. Whatever they expect to find at the end of this run, it isn't this. John, younger, outpaces Peter and reaches the tomb first. He stops at the entrance the way you stop at the edge of something you're not sure you want to see, then crouches down and looks in. What's inside isn't what a grave robbery is supposed to look like. No scattered debris. No sign of a hurried, violent search. Just linen, gathered into loose folds, lying undisturbed where a body should have been. Peter arrives seconds later and does what Peter always does. He doesn't pause. He goes straight in. And there, past the larger wrappings, off to one side, is the detail John's gospel records with unusual precision. A face cloth, folded, and deliberately set apart from everything else in the tomb. Not torn loose in panic. Not left in a heap the way you'd expect from someone who broke in under cover of darkness and dragged a body out in a hurry. Folded. Separate. On purpose. If you grew up around this story, there's a decent chance you've already heard what that folded cloth is supposed to mean. You probably know the version. In first-century Jewish dining custom, when a master finished a meal, he'd toss his napkin onto the table, signaling the servants that they could clear it away. But if he folded the napkin instead, that meant something different. He wasn't finished. He was coming back. And so, the story goes, the folded cloth in the tomb was Jesus leaving behind a coded promise. I'm not finished. I'm coming back. It's a beautiful illustration. But beautiful isn't the same thing as historical. As far as any careful search can determine, this specific custom isn't documented in the ancient Jewish sources normally used to establish practices like this one. No rabbinic writing, no first-century record, nothing that traces the idea back to an actual ancient source rather than a modern retelling. The story appears to have become popular through repeated retelling in modern teaching, gaining the feel of tradition simply through repetition without ever being anchored to a source anyone can point to. That doesn't mean a pastor who told you this story was lying to you. It almost certainly means the story reached them the same way it reached you, already worn smooth by retelling, sounding too fitting to question. That doesn't mean the folded cloth is meaningless. It means its meaning has to come from somewhere sturdier than an illustration nobody can trace. And that's actually good news, because it does. If the cloth wasn't a coded dinner table message, then why did the gospel writer think it was worth mentioning at all? The answer starts with a single Greek word. John's gospel was written in Greek, and the word used to describe what had happened to that face cloth is entetuligmenon, the perfect passive participle of the verb enteliso, meaning to wrap up, roll together, or fold. Grammatically, the perfect tense signals a completed action with a lasting result. Not it was being folded, but it had been folded and remained that way. This isn't a vague, catch-all word for cloth lying somewhere. It describes fabric gathered into a compact shape, and the text presents that shape as its ongoing condition when John finds it, not a passing detail. Here's what that word can responsibly tell us, and what it can't. It tells us the cloth was in a folded or rolled state, deliberately, rather than lying flat or scattered. It does not tell us who folded it, why, or whether the act of folding itself was meant to carry any symbolic weight beyond careful handling. The Greek describes a condition. it doesn't hand us a motive. It's also worth knowing what kind of cloth this actually was. The Greek word for it, soudarion, is a loan word from Latin. Originally a sweat cloth or face cloth, an everyday object. It shows up a few chapters earlier, wrapped around the face of Lazarus when he's called out of his own tomb. It shows up in one of Jesus' parables, as the cloth a cautious servant uses to bury a coin instead of investing it. It shows up again, later, in the book of Acts, as ordinary handkerchiefs carried away from Paul. In every other instance, it's small, personal, unremarkable, which makes its condition here, folded and set apart, stand out precisely because nothing about the object itself was built to be dramatic. There's one more detail in the Greek that's easy to read past, and it's arguably the most specific observation in the whole verse. The text doesn't just say the face cloth was folded. It says it was not lying with the other linen wrappings, but separately, folded up in a place by itself. That's two distinct observations stacked together: the condition of the cloth and its position relative to everything else in the tomb. A writer under no obligation to include a detail this small chose to note both. That level of specificity reads far more like an eyewitness, describing exactly what he saw than a later storyteller constructing a symbol. As for the larger wrappings Peter sees first, the text says they were lying there, using a Greek word that simply means resting, undisturbed, in place. Some readers have pushed this further, suggesting the wrappings had somehow kept the collapsed outline of a body no longer inside them. That reading is possible, but it isn't required by the grammar, and careful readers disagree about how much weight it can bear. What the plain sense of the text does support, without needing to stretch anything, is this: everything in that tomb had been left in order. Nothing had been stripped off and dragged away. If entetulizo just means folded in a general sense, is there anything more specific to it? As it turns out, this isn't the first time that word, or something very close to it, appears in the story of Jesus' body. Go back to the burial itself. When Joseph of Arimathea takes Jesus' body down from the cross, Matthew and Luke describe him wrapping it in linen, while Mark uses closely related wording for the same act. The terminology is related to the language John uses for the cloth found in the tomb, but we shouldn't turn that into a claim that every gospel writer is deliberately repeating the exact same Greek word. John's own account of the burial, told a chapter earlier, doesn't use this specific verb at all. John simply says the body was bound in linen cloths with spices, as was the burial custom of the Jews. So this isn't a wordplay John built entirely within his own gospel, and it would overstate the evidence to claim otherwise. It's something a little different, and arguably more interesting. A verbal echo that surfaces across more than one gospel account of the same event. The careful wrapping of a body at burial, and, 3 days later, a cloth found in a state that echoes that same kind of careful handling. Not a private code word John invented. A pattern that appears when ancient writers describe the same body being treated with deliberate care. If the wrapping at burial and the folded cloth in the tomb both involve this same careful handling, what does that tell us about what happened to the body in between? To answer that, it helps to look at the only other time John's gospel shows us a body walking out of a tomb: Lazarus. John chapter 11. Jesus arrives at his friend's grave 4 days after his death and calls him back to life with 2 words: Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus does come out, but not neatly and not entirely on his own. The text says he emerges still bound, his hands and feet wrapped in strips of burial cloth, his face still covered by a cloth of its own. Jesus has to give a second command just to finish what the first one started: unbind him and let him go. Lazarus needed help getting free of his own grave clothes. He walked out of the tomb still wearing the physical evidence of his death, tangled in it. Because, to use language, the text itself doesn't, but Christian theology has long used to describe the difference. What happened to him was closer to a resuscitation than to what the New Testament means by resurrection. His body was restored to the same kind of mortal life he'd had before. He would, eventually, grow old, or fall sick, or die again, the way everyone eventually does. Same wrappings, same limitations, same ending, simply postponed. Now go back to the garden tomb outside Jerusalem on the 3rd morning after the crucifixion. This time there's no tangled figure stumbling toward the light, needing someone else to cut him free. Nobody has to give a second command to release anyone from anything. The wrappings are simply there, empty, still holding their careful folded shape, and whoever had been inside them is already gone. That contrast isn't something later readers invented to make the story feel neater. It's built directly into the structure of John's Gospel, which places these 2 resurrection accounts as a kind of matched pair, bookending the final week of Jesus' life. One shows a man brought back to the same mortal life he'd had before, still needing human hands to cut him loose from death's wrappings. The other shows something that required no rescue at all. Grave clothes left behind, calmly, the way you leave something you no longer need, not something you had to fight your way out of. That theological contrast is a matter of interpretation, not a verse John states outright. But it's worth asking what this would have looked like physically, on the ground, in an actual first-century tomb. Here's what can be said with real confidence, and where each piece comes from. John's own gospel tells us the body was bound in linen with spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. That's the text itself, not inference. Matthew, Mark, and Luke each add that Joseph of Arimathea provided the tomb, that it was cut into rock and sealed with a large stone. Again, text, not guesswork. Beyond what the Gospels state directly, what's known more broadly about first-century Jewish tombs in the region around Jerusalem describes a fairly consistent pattern. Burial chambers cut into rock, often with a stone shelf or bench along one side where a body would be laid, sealed by a rolling or fitted stone at a low entrance. That's background, not something John tells us specifically about this tomb. But it fits comfortably with what all four Gospels describe, and it helps picture the cramped, dim space John and Peter are running into. As for the spices, John's Gospel says Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, measured in the original Greek as about 100 litra, a Roman weight unit of roughly 11 ounces apiece. Convert that into modern terms, and you land somewhere around 70 to 75 pounds, which is why a number of English translations render it that way. The precise modern figure depends on which conversion you use, so it's worth holding loosely. But however you convert it, the point doesn't depend on exact precision. This was a large, costly quantity, prepared by someone with real means, for someone he considered worth honoring. This wasn't a fast process. It was careful, expensive, and reverent. Which brings us to the obvious skeptical question. Could someone else have arranged this scene? Not Jesus rising, but someone quietly rearranging the evidence afterward? This is where the strongest reasonable alternative deserves a fair hearing. Tombs in this period were occasionally targeted by thieves, sometimes for burial goods, in rarer cases for the bodies themselves. Whatever the motive, speed would have mattered. Someone moving a body in secret, worried about discovery, has little obvious reason to pause inside a cramped, dark tomb and refold a piece of cloth on the way out. If anything, spices packed directly against the skin would have made unwinding those linens slow, sticky work. Exactly the kind of task a thief has every incentive to rush through, and no particular reason to leave tidy behind him. There's also the simple economics of it. Fine linen, and the spices worked into it, had real value in the ancient world. Someone motivated by profit would more plausibly have taken the wrappings along with the body, rather than stripping off one portion of it and folding it neatly before leaving. None of this proves a thief couldn't have done it. A determined skeptic could still construct a scenario, however strained, where someone paused, for reasons we can't reconstruct, to arrange the linens before leaving. The text doesn't mathematically rule out every possibility. What it does is this: a hurried theft can explain an empty tomb. It doesn't naturally explain a folded, separated cloth. It raises a new question rather than closing the original one. This alternative explanation is at least as old as the resurrection claim itself. Matthew's gospel records that the religious authorities paid the soldiers guarding the tomb to say the disciples had stolen the body while they slept, and that this account, Matthew says, was still circulating at the time he wrote. Whatever we make of that report, it tells us the theft theory isn't a modern invention. People were arguing about what happened to that body from the very beginning. Whatever we conclude about that theory, one person in this story reached a very different conclusion in real time. It's worth going back to the exact moment he reached it. Peter has already gone in. He's seen the wrappings, seen the folded cloth, and stepped back out. And John's gospel doesn't tell us what Peter concluded. It simply moves on. Then John goes in. He saw, and he believed. It's worth being precise about what those two Greek words do and don't claim. John doesn't say he worked out a theological argument on the spot, weighing evidence like a jury. He doesn't say an angel explained everything to him, the way Matthew and Luke describe angelic messengers appearing to the women at the tomb. John's account, at this specific verse, credits neither. It simply says he looked at the physical scene in front of him, and something shifted. What did he actually see? Not just an empty room. Mary had already reported that, and it hadn't produced belief, only fear and confusion. John's account places his seeing the grave clothes immediately before saying that he believed. He saw the specific condition of the scene, the wrappings lying there, the face cloth folded and set apart. Whether that particular detail was what caused his belief, John doesn't explicitly tell us. But the sequence is striking. He entered, he saw, and he believed. A scene that didn't naturally look like a hurried removal had confronted him with something he couldn't easily explain. Then, immediately after recording that John believed, the gospel adds a detail that's easy to miss, and honest enough that it reads more like careful reporting than flattering embellishment. They still did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Sit with that ordering for a second. The one moment in the entire scene where someone is said to believe is followed immediately by an admission that the theological framework for that belief wasn't even in place yet. John didn't arrive at the tomb already expecting a resurrection and then go looking for confirming evidence. He arrived expecting grief, found something that didn't fit grief, and let that discrepancy move him before he had the doctrine to explain it. That matters. It means the physical evidence wasn't decorating a conclusion the disciples already wanted to reach. At minimum, John's own gospel presents this detail as something that did real work in producing belief. Not courtroom proof, but evidence significant enough that an eyewitness records it as the very thing he was looking at in the instant the text says he believed. So what does the folded cloth actually mean? Not a coded promise about a future return. However comforting that version sounds, it rests on a custom nobody has been able to document. Sermons aren't historical sources, and repetition isn't evidence. Here's what the evidence that's actually there supports. The Greek wording describes something folded and deliberately set apart, using a term whose closest echo elsewhere in the Gospels involves the careful wrapping of Jesus' body at burial. Not proof of resurrection on its own, but a detail suggestive of intention rather than accident. The comparison with Lazarus shows what it looks like when someone needs to be freed from grave clothes, and this wasn't that. The grave clothes were simply left behind, empty. The burial customs of the period and the practical mechanics of theft make a hurried robbery an awkward fit for a scene this orderly, even without ruling it out entirely. And John's own gospel identifies this exact detail as the thing he was looking at in the moment his own account says he believed, before he even had the theological framework to explain what that belief meant. No single thread here is a nail in a coffin. Together, they explain why a gospel writer, under no obligation to record something this small, chose to describe a piece of cloth with enough specific detail that readers are still examining his word choice 2,000 years later. So what does any of this have to do with you? John didn't have the whole picture that morning. He had one piece of evidence, examined honestly, and for him it was enough to take a real step, from confusion toward belief, before he understood everything that belief would eventually mean. That's worth sitting with if you're in a season where you don't have the whole picture either. A diagnosis you're still waiting to understand. A decision you can't yet see the far side of. A relationship or a loss you haven't made sense of. You don't need the full theology worked out before you're allowed to respond honestly to what's actually in front of you. John didn't wait until he understood resurrection to let the evidence move him. He looked closely at what he could actually see and let that be enough for that day. And notice what he found when he looked closely. Not chaos, but order, in the one place order seemed least likely to survive. The 3 days before that morning had given every reason to expect the opposite. Abandonment, disorder, a story ending badly and staying that way. Instead, the detail he found was careful, deliberate, intact. If you're in a season that feels like that tomb before the stone was rolled back, torn apart, unattended, nobody minding the details, this story doesn't promise you'll understand why, not right away. But it does suggest something worth holding on to. The appearance of chaos isn't always the whole story, even when it's the only part you can currently see. Picture John one more time, crouched at the entrance to that tomb, before any of this had occurred to him yet. He doesn't know the Greek grammar behind the word for what he's looking at. He hasn't thought about Lazarus, or burial customs, or a napkin custom that, as far as we can tell, nobody in his century had ever heard of either. All he has, in that moment, is a piece of linen arranged in a way that doesn't naturally suggest a hurried removal, and an empty space where his teacher's body should have been. He saw, and he believed. Not because the cloth itself was magic, not because folded fabric proves a miracle on its own, but because everything in that tomb told the same quiet story. Nothing here had been torn away. The cloth itself wasn't the miracle. It wasn't proof of the resurrection by itself. It was one small detail inside a much larger resurrection claim. A detail that, in John's account, belonged to the physical scene he saw before he believed. The miracle the tomb points to was never the fold. It was that death, when they finally looked inside, had nothing left to hold on to. If this is the first time you've heard the real story behind that folded cloth, you're not alone. Tell us in the comments what stood out to you most. And if you want more investigations like this one, the small biblical details most people rush past, subscribe and share this with someone who's only ever heard the napkin version.